everyone, and welcome to our Thursday of week 4 lecture. This is our lecture on Pompeii's wall paintings and the Roman Domus. So we're really going to be looking at domestic life today, at houses, and at the art that you would see in the houses. So to start us off, you'll remember this from last time, just to situate us, right? So we are at Pompeii, which is near southern Italy on the coast, in the Bay of Naples. And then this is the city layout of Pompeii. So remember the grid system, and we had the things that we talked about last time, these public spaces. So we had the Forum over here, the theater complex, the amphitheater, and then we also had the Decumanus, that street, the Cardo, and our big circuit wall that goes around all of it. So again, these are things you would see in almost every Roman town, these hallmarks of Roman architecture, of Roman urban life. Those are the public buildings, right? Like I said, today we're going to be looking at domestic life, at private life. So all of these other things that you see on the map, all these things that are on the streets are shops and houses. So we talked about shops last time, and I left us on this image as the bridge between the two lectures, right? Because what we see is that the front of houses would actually be rented out to shop owners. And these shops would set up in the front two rooms of the house, and then the house would extend beyond it. So like I said, we saw this last time. This is the house of the tragic poet. A lot of times the houses are named for wall paintings that you see in the homes. And so in this case, there was a wall painting of a tragic poet. So this is the house of the tragic poet. And you can see that this would have been a shop. This is like a boarded up shop, right? And then this is a shop that's open for business. And you can see that counter where it would have held the food. It's kind of like a fast food restaurant. And then here, we see the doorway that would have led into the home. And so these are shops, and this is the homeowner's entrance. So we're going to look a little bit closer at all of these parts of the home. So first off, I want to address what we call it. So we call it a domus, right? And if you look it up, that translates in Latin to house, but we use it to signify a specific type of house, and that is a townhouse. So it would have been a house in the city. It wouldn't have been like a villa, which might be out in the countryside, sort of a farmhouse, maybe a luxury house that has its own plantation in a way. Not a house like that. It's a house in a city, and it's mostly for the upper class. So this isn't necessarily what everyone lived in. It would be mainly for the upper middle class and upper class if you lived in the city. And I think we talked about with Rome, right? The most important people would live closest to the Forum. And so we kind of see that in many towns around Rome, that the closer you are to the Forum, the more important you are, the wealthier you are. So it was actually a sign of your social status to have a big house like this inside the city. So we're going to walk through it, through these different rooms that, if you imagine, we start at the beginning and make our way toward the back, all the different things that we would see. Something else that's important to note about the domus is that it is frontally oriented, and there is this long axis that goes throughout the whole house. So I feel like we've talked about this so many times in this class, but the Roman emphasis on very frontally oriented buildings. So there is a clear entrance. There's not multiple ways to get inside the building. There is one clear entrance. And that's what you can see here, right? And if we went back one, that's again, you see this, there's this one entrance and then a long axis through the house. And this is not a specific house that we're looking at here. So it's sort of a general floor plan. And you'll see how variations are made on it. So although this is a general floor plan, people did make changes to it. And you'll see sometimes it be a bit thicker, more rooms coming off, or it'll be even longer. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but this is the general shape, and generally there's one front entrance, and then that leads into a long axis. So we have these long homes that stretch back from the street. And generally, when we go along that long axis, it moves from public to private space. So the domus in particular was not simply a private residence. It was owned by someone. There was a homeowner who lived there, But as I said, these were people of the upper class, or the upper middle class, right? And so they were business people, essentially. They were high in society, and we'll talk a lot about this system called the patron-client system. And in that system, the homeowner, who was, again, prominent person in society, they would welcome people into their home. And there was this patron-client system in which there was, as I said, a wealthy patron, and then there was a client. And this client might be someone who is a bit poorer, maybe even a former slave, something like that. But there's this reciprocal relationship there where they both kind of do favors for each other. So it's a business partnership in a way, and the patron does in a way have the upper hand because they are wealthier, but usually they want things too. So an example, in Pompeii, we see a lot of political graffiti. We see inscriptions on walls, people scratching things on walls about which candidate you should vote for. And a lot of times these candidates for public office, for local government, were really high people in society. So they were upper class people in society. And if you're an upper class person in society and you want to get elected, then you need the votes of all the citizens, right? And so what you might do is you might offer to do a favor for someone of more lower class, maybe the merchant class, right? You'll say, if I do a favor for you, and you are, you know, someone who makes shoes, you're a cobbler or something, right? If I do a favor for you, will you convince everyone else in your guild, all the other cobblers or all your friends, right? Can you convince all of them to vote for me? And so a lot of times, you know, we see that they need each other. So although there is this person who's wealthier in society, obviously they have a lot to offer someone who's not as well off. They also need the help of the masses, often to gain political advantage, to get into office or to get elected, something like that. And that all plays out in the Domus. So what would happen is these meetings, you know, these deals, making deals, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine, that kind of thing, would happen in the Domus of the patron, in the patron-client system. So the Domus was very important as not just a house that you live in and then you go about your business elsewhere. It was home and office all in one. And, you know, in the pandemic that we're in, that might make a little bit more sense, right? Your house is also your office now. But for the Romans, that was the norm. So let's walk through it starting at the beginning. The first thing that we have, the doorway starting off, is the fauces. So the fauces is the entryway, vestibule. It's that first kind of entrance hall when you first walk in, right? So it's a little bit of a hallway. And we see that right here. And it would actually be that narrow space in between the shops. So the patron, the house owner owns this house, rents out the front two shops, and that space in between where you walk from the sidewalk into the house, so you're not quite inside the house yet, it's kind of this liminal space, the fauces. So that's the entryway. From the fauces, you walk into the atrium. So the atrium is this central hall. You can see it, it's kind of surrounding this area. It's square in shape usually, and it's kind of, like I said, a central point where you can go to a lot of different places from it. So there's rooms off of it. You continue into the rest of the house. It's your first, once you walk through the entryway, then you're standing in it. And so it's this very central room. Something that the atrium usually had was something called an impluvium. So an impluvium, you see that number 3 right here, that would actually be a pool. And so if you can see on this, there's an opening in the roof and it would collect rainwater so that rain would fall through the roof. They didn't really have as sloped of roofs as we do now, those really pitched roofs. So it would have an opening and then the rainwater would be collected and then you could use the rainwater also. But it was also just kind of a decorative feature as well, in addition to being useful, is that you could, that it just looked nice to have this pool when you first walk in. And again, you know, it's a public space here, the entryway and then the atrium. These are the more public spaces of the house. So this is where you want to impress your guests. This is where you're going to be receiving people who enter your home. So you want it to look nice. You can see that off the atrium, those rooms on either side, we have cubicula, which are bedrooms. So in any house, although it is a building of many purposes, you do need to sleep there. But the bedrooms were generally just for sleeping. They weren't super big. They weren't maybe like your room now, where it's also where you hang out, where you do work, where you play video games. It's your hangout spot. Bedrooms were really just for sleeping. They didn't have much else in them. And then, so those are number 4 on the map. If we see them, they're around the atrium. And again, this is a general plan, so things might have been different depending on the house, but this is sort of generally what we see. The next one is allée, which are these wing rooms, which aren't really rooms. They're kind of just these spaces while we're transitioning into the back of the house. So those side rooms there. And then the next one is really important, the Tublinum. The Tublinum is essentially the office of the house. That is where the master of the home would conduct his business. So when he receives people into the house, right, they walk through the atrium, and the Tublinum is very centrally located because you want them to have a direct shot in, and that's where you would actually have the meeting. That's where you would hash out the deal, where you would do business. And it has a beautiful view onto the Peristyle. So the Peristyle would be a colonnade surrounding an open courtyard. So it's an outdoor space. If you look on the map, we see right here that there's that opening to let light in. So it's kind of like a backyard, basically. A backyard or a patio or a courtyard, really, because it's bound on all sides by the house. So it's not like a backyard that we might have in the US where it's literally in the back of the house. In this case, it's in the middle, kind of. But it would have been open, would have been very lush, green, definitely an outdoor space. That would have been ringed by these columns. And as I've talked about with colonnades, they're great places to stroll, to talk and walk, And so we see sort of a pseudo, like an ambulatory, kind of like we've talked about in temples, where there's this area that you can walk in between the colonnade and the rooms. The Peristyle also would have had these rooms, more bedrooms, perhaps servants' quarters even coming off of it. And then we see, in this one, we see in the back of the house, not always in the back of the house, sometimes in other spaces, but the triclinium. And you should know the triclinium by now because we talked about it so much with Etruscan tombs, right? So the depiction of the triclinia that we would see in the tombs in the Etruscan necropoli, right? But here we see them as rooms. So this is what they really would have been like in a real house. And you'll notice again, so I talked about this transition of public to private space. So in the front of the house, again, that entryway, the atrium, the Tublinum, all places that you might do business, that you would have these guests who are not necessarily your friends, they're kind of more like business people, business partners. Those would all be in the front of your house. And as we move into the Peristyle, into those back bedrooms and into the triclinium, that's where we start to see more private space. So those are more invited spaces. These business partners, these people who are clients of the master of the house, probably aren't, well, they might not be invited to dine with the home, right? So they might not be invited to the triclinium. That's usually in the back of the house, requires a separate invitation. Friends would go there, invited guests, but the front of the house is more office space for business, right? So we see a bit of a transition there. And although these also are marked as cubicula on the map, they might not have been bedrooms. They might have just been rooms for other purposes also, because a lot of times we do see those cubiculi, which is the plural cubiculi, in the back of the house, right? So again, that transition of public to private space as we move along this long axis of this frontally oriented house. So that's a bit of an overview, great overview in your textbook too on page 14 to 16. So if you want to refer back to that, I highly recommend it. But we're going to look at a lot of examples of this. So let's get started. The first one is, this is from your book. So just again, it's very similar, but I wanted to show you how there can be variations on this. So it generally looks the same, frontally oriented, long axis, but we do see the triclinium, for instance, not in the back, it's on the side. And the triclinium also is usually on the Peristyle, because again, like the Tublinum and the triclinium, these are two really important spaces for your guests. So they're both, the Tublinum is where you're going to do business. The triclinium is where you're going to entertain, it's a dining room. So that's where your friends come over, and the Tublinum is where your business guests come over. But either way, you want to impress these people. And so either way, those are going to be on the Peristyle because you want them to have a great view of the beautiful courtyard, you know, the lush greenery. Sometimes they would, if you were really wealthy, you might import exotic plants and have those in your Peristyle. So the Peristyle is really what you want to show off in the house. So the most important rooms, the most sort of rooms that you want to show off, the triclinium and the Tublinum, are going to face the Peristyle. So that's an example here. And then you can also see some of the artwork that we would have had, maybe frescoes on the wall. We're going to look at a lot of frescoes in this lecture, so stay tuned. But and then also mosaic floors. So this might give you a little bit more sense of the colorful aspects of the house. A real world example that we have, if you have been down to Los Angeles and been to the Getty Villa, it is a complete reconstruction of something called the Villa of the Papyri, which is a villa outside of Herculaneum. So that is a bit more removed from the city. It's not right in the heart of the city, but it follows this exact same floor plan that we've just been talking about. And the Getty Villa, Mr. Getty, I suppose, was a huge fan of Herculaneum. And so the Getty Villa was this museum that he built to look just like this house in Herculaneum, and it is the center of ancient art. One of the few, you know, purely ancient art museums in the US. So a great collection there. If you're in Los Angeles, I recommend you go there. It's one of my favorite museums. But it's really cool because, like I said, it looks like this house. So where we're standing right now would be in the Fauces, and then we would be looking at the atrium, looking at that impluvium. You can see it there, right, filled with water. There's an opening in the ceiling to let that rainwater in. And then we're looking down that super far axis into the Peristyle. And then this one, the Getty Villa, was even more luxurious, or the one that they're modeling themselves after, the Villa of the Papyri, was really luxurious, and it actually had 2 courtyards. So if we look here, you can see that there's that Peristyle, and in this example, or even in this example, it just ends. Well, the Villa of the Papyri has another one. So in really luxurious, really fancy houses, you could add another Peristyle on. So there's kind of these chunks, and you can just keep repeating the chunks, or you can put them in different places. These kind of units of the Peristyle with the rooms around it. So that's the Getty Villa. I think I have another picture later on. But again, just look at that really long line of sight. That line of sight was really important in these houses because they wanted you to really be able to see how big the house was, even if you're maybe the client of the patron, right? So you're maybe not as high in society. You've come there to ask a favor, but even you understand the grandeur, the wealth of the person who lives here, because although you're not allowed in the back, although they're not going to invite you to the triclinium way in the back, you can kind of get a glimpse at it because you can look down the super long axis. You have a really long line of sight, and you can see those back private rooms. So here is a real example. This is in Pompeii. It's called the House of Menander. And again, it's actually the exact same viewpoint. So if we're here in the Getty Villa standing, you know, we've just entered the atrium. That's where we are. And this, we're still in the Fauces, so we haven't quite entered the atrium. We're looking into it, and we can see all the way through, past the impluvium, past these rooms. We can see all the way into the Peristyle, which is that bright, you know, doorway back here. So again, that long line of sight. The House of Menander, just a little bit of background for you. So it's named for this portrait that we found in the house right here that you see on the left. So there's some debate about what this is. They're holding a text that has Menander on it. Menander was a poet and a very famous poet. And so there's a work of Menander on that text, that thing right. Oh, where'd my mouse go? There we go, right there. And so there's been debate about if this is supposed to be a depiction of Menander, or if it is the owner of the house, the master of the house, reading Menander. So either way, that's what the house is named for. And we have some great remains from it. Something else that we found there is bones of people who perished in the eruption. So this is in one of the side rooms, and what happened was, you know, in the first phase of the eruption, right? I talked about last time when that rocks and ash and all of that was falling from the sky. A lot of people escaped. A lot of people evacuated. And what we see here is a group of people with tools. They have like pickaxes, shovels, lamps, etc. There's about a dozen bodies found in the house in various rooms. So this is just one of them. But what we think these are, based on the tools that they were found with, are probably lower class citizens who, once the patron of the house and his family, this wealthier family, evacuated, these people came in as looters and they tried to loot the mansion. And while they were trying to loot the mansion, the second phase of the eruption hit, that pyroclastic flow hit, and they were killed in the home. And so that's why we have their remains today, along with all of their tools that they were using to break into the home and possibly loot it. So that's still on display today. You can actually see them in the rooms that they were found. Something else that would have happened in the atrium. So as I said, we're going to kind of start at the front and move to the back. The atrium would have had something called a Lorarium, and this is actually from the house of Menander. So I'm going to go back to, and if we're standing here again at the entryway, you can see it in that back corner, right? So that's what we're going to be looking at right now. It's called a Lorarium. A Lorarium is a household shrine. So the Romans, right, very religious people, and they would have not just temples, but they would also have shrines in their homes. And they would also have certain gods that their family were more, that they would worship more, you know, they felt closer to. They'd have these household gods. So these household gods are called lares. You can see that right there. And so a shrine to your household gods is called a Lorarium. So those two words are kind of associated. And that's what we see here. It's almost like a mini temple, right? So it looks like it might be, it's not really in a perfect order. Some Doric columns maybe, or they have a base, so I don't know. And then there's this frieze and the pitched roof. So we kind of see a little mock temple. And this would have been a place to do your daily offerings to your household gods, you know, a modest ritual, maybe every morning, something like that. Something cool that we also see next to the Lorarium are remains of stairs. So these are really rare. When the pyroclastic flow hit and when the eruption was happening, it wiped out a lot of the second stories of houses. And so we don't see hardly any of them in Pompeii. I think I said last lecture that we see a lot of second stories in Herculaneum, but not in Pompeii. But here we see that the houses would have had second levels, and especially here because we see stairs that would have led up there. So kind of a rare thing and hinting at something that we no longer have today. So that's the atrium. I mentioned this earlier and I kind of got into it early, but just to reiterate, yeah, so again, the atrium and the Tublinum are the most public spaces. That's where you would meet your business guests. And this idea of a mutually beneficial relationship. So you're going to approach the master of the house, try to plead your case, try to get support, and then you might also do something for them, right? So it's this reciprocal relationship. And something that goes along with that also, because, you know, it moves from public to private, but you still have to be let in. The master of the house still has to agree to meet with you. So in the morning, what people would do is they would line up outside the house of a prominent person in Pompeii or whatever city. Here it's Pompeii. And they would hope to have a meeting, and they would talk to the person at the door. There'd be like a doorman, you know, kind of like a bouncer slash secretary who's handling the ins and outs of the house. And so you would wait to be let in, and that person was usually a slave, one of the members of the slaves in the household of the servant class. And so this is a look into the Fauces. And so say you're standing outside, you're waiting to be let in, and already, again, that line of sight, you can kind of start to see through the house. But something really cool that we see in this Fauces is this mosaic of this dog. And we actually have a few. We saw a dog on the painting in that shop, you know, last time, that shop that they just found in December, there was that painting of a dog, and it actually looks really similar to this dog that we have a mosaic of. So maybe that was a common type of dog in Pompeii, I don't know. But you see below it, it says Cave Canem, which means beware of dog, essentially. So similar things that we see today. Perhaps this household had a dog, and it was a bit of a guard dog also, so that if you're not allowed in, if the master doesn't want to meet with you, you know, don't mess with the dog. So next up, the Tublinum, right? So say you've been let in, you've waited in the atrium and now it's your time to meet with the master of the house. You would do so in the Tublinum. So again, that's that kind of middle area. So we're standing in the atrium right now, we're looking through, and again, you can see the peristyle behind you. You can see that courtyard. So lines of sight, very important. And also the fact that Tublinum is right on the peristyle, so it's kind of pleasant. This is a digital reconstruction, but I think it's pretty accurate. You can see that maybe there would have been some kind of furniture, maybe a desk or some kind of area where you can meet, a table you can meet at. Also would have been lavishly decorated. So we see these intricate mosaic floors like we just saw with the dog. Those would have continued inside the house. Columns as well, you know, lots of opulent materials. This one actually shows curtains. So if you did want to have a more private meeting, maybe you could close the curtains and have that private meeting in there. And then we also see sculptures in the home as well, painted walls, overall trying to make a good impression, trying to show off your wealth if you're the master of the house in this Tublinum. And like I said, so you're in the Tublinum, right, and you're looking out into the Peristyle. So here is maybe what the Peristyle would have looked like. This is, again, going back to the house of Menander. The Peristyle there, so very lush, you know, lots of plants, well tended. You would have had slaves tending to it. So you want to make that good impression. And you know, even now, things in a city can get very congested and crowded. And so nice to have some open space, some natural space in your own home. And there's also, you can see that walkway that would have been in between the colonnade and the rooms. You see some people who are walking there. So just to kind of summarize what we've talked about with House of Menander. So this is the floor plan of it. So here we are on the street. We walk through the entryway into the atrium with the impluvium. That was this photo that we saw earlier. You're going to walk through the Tublinum, and then you're in the Peristyle. And once you're in the Peristyle, you can go into all of these other rooms. Something else to note is that there would have been servants' quarters, a kitchen, things like that, things that you need to run a household, especially if you are upper class. You know, you need a place for your servants to sleep, a kitchen for them to cook you your food, right? So we see a kitchen over here. I think it's an Italian. I couldn't find an English one, but a kitchen kind of off to the side. And so these things are going to be kind of hidden. We don't want to see them when you're having a meeting with the master of the house, when you're relaxing in the Peristyle, whatever. Those ones are going to be a little bit set back. Things, you know, not as obvious where the servants are and where the kitchen is. And just to reiterate also that we see a variation of that initial floor plan. So there's still a very linear access from when you first walk in. You can see all the way to the end of the Peristyle. But in this case, we see more, the rooms are kind of set off to the side as opposed to behind the Peristyle. Another example of the Peristyle from the Getty Villa. So this one is an even more opulent one. It's quite large, you know, we see statues in the Peristyle there. I mean, this is a reconstruction, but similar things. And remember, as I noted, that there on the Villa of the Pompeii, which this is a reconstruction of, there were 2 Peristyles. So you're really opulent, you've got 2 of them. And you can see that we've just walked into the first Peristyle, and you can still see all the way to the next one through that long line of sight. So as I mentioned, the triclinium, we've talked a lot about these, as I said, in the Etruscan necropolis. So there's another example, the Tomb of the Leopards in Tarquinia. You should recognize that one by now. So here's an actual triclinium that we would see. Again, triclinium meaning 3 couches, like the room of the 3 couches. But that is how Romans dined. So they would dine on these couches. So there you see it, they would be built in, and then you would have some pillows or, you know, other kind of things to make it more comfy. And then you would put the food on a table in the middle. So just another example. I'm not going to spend too much time on that because I think we got that one. So to reiterate though, here we are, we walk through the atrium, there's the Tublinum, and then maybe the triclinium is off to the sides. You get to look out at the beautiful Peristyle while you eat. But as I said, not everyone lives in these fancy townhouses or fancy kind of city mansions with servants. Most of the people living in the Roman Empire would have been the lower class, would have been the merchant class, something like that, and they would have lived in apartments. So not too different than we have now. You know, if you can't afford a big house in the middle of the city, you're going to be living in an apartment. So that's what we see. This is actually not at Pompeii. We don't really have many from Pompeii, but this is from Ostia, which is it's right outside Rome. So it's kind of the port city of Rome. Rome wasn't right on the ocean, so this is the closest, the city that was in between them, kind of. So Ostia, apartments in the Roman world were called insulae, plural insula, Insula literally means island, and the idea there is that it's, well, it would take up a whole city block, so it's almost this self-contained island, I suppose, in the middle of the city that people live on. And also something about these is that they weren't necessarily super convenient. They didn't have all the amenities that a house would have, so you would likely have to go downstairs to get food. Maybe they wouldn't, you know, we don't really know if there would be much of a kitchen or bath. It kind of varies, but they didn't necessarily have all the conveniences that a domus would have. These would mostly also have been built of concrete and then faced with brick, as you see there. So nothing too fancy. We don't really see any marble in these. Also, a lot of times the bottom level could have been a shop, so you could have lived above a shop. So a lot of similarities that we see with apartments now, you know, especially in big cities. These could have gotten all the way up to 5 stories tall. So again, we have high rises, you know, not too different than now. So here's a reconstruction of what one at Ostia might have looked like. It's a drawing that someone did, but you can see how tall it would have been and how not, I mean, it wasn't super pleasant. It would have been pretty crowded, pretty cramped. You probably would have preferred to live in a domus, especially because you can still live in the middle of the city in a domus. So there's nothing really luxurious about these apartments. These are pretty bare bones for the lower class. So that's going to do it for our talk of houses, but we're going to move now to wall paintings. So wall paintings often would have covered the domus, the walls of the domus, especially in the atrium and the cubiculi, right, in the bedrooms, and in the triclinium as well. Pretty much all the rooms would have been lavishly painted in a domus. So we see a development of wall painting. So I want to break this down and just let you know kind of, so what we're going to be looking at is a development. So we're going to be looking at it in the beginning and then how it develops over time. So we have 4 phases of wall paintings, or 4 styles, and they are very you know, blandly named in the sense that it is the first style, the second style, the third style, and the 4th style. Yes, so 4 styles, each named for their order. So we have the first one is the first, you know, the earliest one, the first style, and then it moves through time to the 4th style. We see all of these at Pompeii, and something important to note also is that a lot of times homes would have had multiple styles in them. So just because a house was built in a certain time, you know, even if the house was built at a certain time, it could have been renovated and repainted. So what we see a lot of times is maybe one room is in one style and another room is in another style, which might be like your house, you know, that you grew up in. Maybe the bathroom is from the 80s and hasn't been redone, but the living room has been redone. So the living room looks very modern, but the bathroom still looks like it's from the 80s, something like that. Very common in houses. So let's go ahead. We're going to go through them one by one. This is a helpful slide, though, and so you can refer back to this when you're studying to get kind of the general overview. So the first one that we see is the first style, as I said, and the first style is very simple. So the first style is characterized by these big blocks, and the whole point of the first style, 200 to 80 BC, the whole point of the first style is that it's supposed to look like marble revetment, right? So you're trying to make your house look like you have these beautiful marble walls, except they're not marble. It's just the normal wall that you have painted to look like marble. So that's what we see, and they would have been very colorful. So we see an illustration of it from the Samnite house in Herculaneum, and then we see the actual house you know, that they're depicting there. And so these big blocks, right, they're just very architectural. They're very meant to look like stone. So there's not much ornamentation to them. They're fairly simple. And they're very geometric also. And again, there's a lot of Greek reception here. So these marble blocks are trying to mimic Hellenistic styles, right? So marble that might have come from Greece, something like that. That's another point, is that you're trying to make your house look a bit wealthier by, you know, oh, I imported this marble from Greece, yes, when in fact it's just painted on the walls. So people would have probably been able to tell that it was fake, but the point is that it's supposed to try to look a little bit nicer, right? Look a little fancy. It imitates ashlar cut masonry also. So if you remember way back from the temple of the Capitoline Triad, we talked about ashlar masonry, which is when you have these cut stones, you cut them into these cubes and then you fit them together. So that's kind of what we're trying to see here. Even though it's one flat wall, they're painting it into this ashlar masonry kind of shape. So that's the first such style. I think I have another Yeah, so here's another example of it from Pompeii. This one's from your textbook, the House of Sallust. And you can see, again, those bright, fun colors of marble pieced together like it's ashlar masonry, but underneath the wall is just a normal wall. It's nothing actually that's marble. Moving on to the second style. So first style, architectural block. Second style, we see a bit more of complexity in the artwork here. And the whole point of second style wall painting is this idea of the trompe l'oeil. So that is, you'll see that at the bottom, and that means trick of the eye. It's actually a French term. So we've been using a lot of Latin, now we have some French. Trompe l'oeil, which is the trick of the eye. And so the whole point of it, which actually the first style uses a little bit of because it's kind of trying to make you think that it's marble, but this is really doing it in the sense that it's tricking your eye into thinking that you're looking at a scene outdoors, that it's trying to make your eye think that you're looking at a window when really you're just looking at a flat wall. So we see these lavish landscapes outside, outside, right? That you're supposed to be thinking like you're looking out into this beautiful courtyard, maybe with a temple or something like that. But really you're in your domus in the middle of the city, and you've got other buildings on every side. And as I said last time, there was no zoning laws. So you might be right next door to a brothel and you might not have the nicest surroundings. But if you paint your house to look like this, then you can imagine that you're in this lush courtyard. And I mean, in this close up, we see this colonnade, right? So it really draws the eye. And so it's making it look like there's depth. We see that it's kind of classic painting in the sense that we have these diagonal lines that lead your eye into a spot further in space. And so we have this vanishing point almost in the sense that you are looking into a scene where the things in the back are smaller. This is all kind of hallmarks of landscape painting. Stuff that we see especially in the Renaissance, but we see it here in Rome, where we see these ideas of depth, that you're looking outside, you're looking into a landscape, into space. And so there's this temple in the front, and then there's a kind of a peristyle around it. So maybe your house doesn't have a peristyle, but you can pretend you have one. Something else that categorizes this style is the use of architectural elements. And so they loved doing that as well, that you see these architectural elements present on the walls, again, painted, not real architectural elements, but painted to look like columns or pilasters. Here we can see some Ionic columns, maybe a little bit of Corinthian there. Again, this roof, this pitched roof with the break in the middle, columns. What else do we see? Yeah, even the architectural elements outside. So we have like a tholos right there, a bit of an archway. So lots of architectural references, and really trying to make you think that you are, looking outside into a garden or something like that. Something else to note is that this is building on the first style, so it's a development, right? So this is the style that would have come after it in time, but it also incorporates some of the first style in it. So if we look down here, we actually see first style painting. So we see first style, and then above it we have the hallmark of the second style, but those blocks that we see in the bottom are very characteristic of the first style, right? So again, illusionistic painting, we're dissolving the wall. So the wall is being dissolved and it looks like it just goes out into space, and the only thing holding up the roof are these columns. Again, it's this idea of tricking the eye, of making it look like an illusion, that there's actually no wall there. It's just open space, and these columns are the ones holding up the roof above you. So things like that. Not necessarily mimicking Hellenistic anymore. It looks more like we're looking out onto a Roman scene, a very Roman style as well. And one more term to note is that's right, that lowest portion of the wall where we see the first style painting is called the dado, D-A-D-O. And so there's this scene that's resting on this dado, and the dado is the kind of row here of first style type blocks. So we see a lot of architectural elements, as I said, a lot of the built environment being painted onto these walls. As a note, this one is not in Pompeii. This is in Boscoreale, which is a different part of Italy. So this one's actually not at Pompeii. Neither is this one. This is actually from Prima Porta, right? So the Augustus Prima Porta, same place. And this is still second style, right? So we still have that trompe l'oeil. We're still trying to trick the eye, but in this case, we don't use architectural elements. We're just painting this giant, massive gardenscape. So it's supposed to feel like you're in a peristyle almost, you know, like you're in nature. Again, living in the city, in the middle of the city with the brothel next door, you want some sense of nature. You don't want to feel like you're in the city. You want to feel like you're outdoors at a villa in the countryside. And so they paint the walls to really look like this. So this is sort of the first landscape painting that we have also, right? Because this style of painting a big lush scene is something later painters, you know, all the way up through you know, the Impressionists even, and people like that would take inspiration from in painting their landscapes. And so we see that in the Roman era. Another term for you here is atmospheric perspective. So atmospheric perspective, the important thing to note about that is that we are rendering things in depth, as I said. So there's a decreased clarity, just as your eye works. If you're looking at something in the foreground, perhaps right now you're watching about this on your laptop. Your laptop is really clear, right? There's really distinct edges, everything's very clear. But if you kind of look at the stuff around you, it's blurry, right? In the background, maybe there's a wall behind you or something, then that wall is kind of blurry because it's further away. So that's what we're seeing here. Also, the trees that are really close to you, that are right in the foreground, the biggest things, those are very clear. They're very clearly rendered. And then as we look at the trees in the background, they're much blurrier. And that's exactly how your eye works. So it's called atmospheric perspective. And it's that idea that things in the front are really clear, really sharp, and the things in the back are blurrier because they are further away. And so when our eye focuses on something in the front, the things in the back get blurrier. And so that's what we see here as well. So that is second style. It can use those architectural elements like we saw in Boscoreale, or it can just be a sort of landscape where you're supposed to feel like you're outside, as we see here in Prima Porta. Now we're going to move to third style, which looks very different. So it's sort of an abstracted version in a way of the second style, because we actually see architectural elements, but they're super delicate. They're super fine, super skinny, super delicate. There's a sort of a minimalism to this in a way, and that we have the first style, right, has these architectural blocks, the idea of making a better wall. And then the second style says, no, we don't want a wall at all. We're just going to pretend that that's a window and we can see outside. Here, we're back to the first style where we say we want to make the wall itself look better. So what we see here are, again, elements of these broad panels, I guess, of monochromatic color. So they're just one giant color. And then we have another register that's another color. So it's very monochrome on each level. It doesn't try to hide the wall, right? So again, we're not pretending this is a window. We know it's a wall, but we have these architectural elements. So the first is the colonnettes. That's what we call them because they're not real columns. They're these very skinny, very delicate columns, which are going to act as frames. So these colonnettes, you know, columnette, essentially, yes, colonnettes are framing the painting. So that's these really skinny column-like things that are delineating different scenes. And then inside, we see paintings, but we don't see like landscape paintings. They don't look super realistic and they're not to scale. So it's not like you can step into them. They're very miniature and they're very refined and on a much smaller scale. And so they do incorporate some sort of perspective. You know, there's depth in a way. If you look at it, it looks somewhat realistic in a sense, but it doesn't look like we can step into it. It's not trying to trick your eye to think that you can walk into it because it's obviously quite tiny. And again, the dado here, oops, okay, yeah, I guess I just have these pictures, kind of resembles first style, right? So there's a little bit of that element of that these might be architectural blocks. Although we do see some communication between the two registers, which we didn't really have in the second style. So there's no communication between the dado and the major scene. But here there's a little bit more, and that this line kind of extends all the way through. You can see that. So there's some kind of consideration of the two working together. But again, really monochromatic panels. That's a huge one, monochromatic panels, and then a small scene in the middle. That's going to characterize third style. Fourth style is where we go all out. So fourth style, 50 to 79 CE, and we say 79 because that is when the eruption was, and the person, the art historian who came up with these styles, who characterized them by these four styles, was largely working off Pompeii. So we say fourth style is 50 to 79 CE. Fourth style is pretty much a combination of everything that we've seen so far. The way that the second and third kind of incorporated aspects of the first, we see the fourth style incorporating aspects of everything. So if we look here in the middle, right, like that looks like third style. We have this really monochromatic panel and then a small scene in the middle. So that's kind of like third style. But we also have more realistic architectural elements. So we have things like colonnettes, you know, kind of like that's maybe there's some framing. Oh, up top, there you go. That kind of looks like one. But we also have things that look more realistic in a way. So if you look at this, this is like an architectural element. It almost looks like a mantle or something. That's kind of more like second style. It's kind of trying to trick you and make you think that there's an architectural element there, and that's what's holding up the roof, right? And then of course we also see first style, so we see panels as well. This isn't the best depiction of it, but on the dado we would see again those marble panels that are trying to look like you have marble walls when really you're just painting it to look like that. So those are the 4 styles. We'll be looking a little bit more at them, having some more practice. But anything else that I want to say? I want to make sure that I got everything. Yeah, the hanging garlands, that's what it was. So these here are very third style, but we see them incorporated with everything else. So those are the 4 styles. I want to look now at this house that we're actually looking at. So this is the house of the Getty. It is in Pompeii, and it's one of the most interesting houses in Pompeii, in my opinion. So we're going to kind of look at all of it, everything that it has. So these are some wall paintings. I was trying to remember, I think this is the Faustus. So I think we've just walked in, and I think this is the atrium back here. This is actually my picture, so I should remember, but I'm pretty sure because you can see some light. So I think you're outside right there, and then you're walking into the entryway. But here is a plan of it. So the entrance is actually right here. So just to get you situated, right? And then again, we're looking through the atrium, and then there's the peristyle. So there's that long line of sight, and then we've got rooms kind of coming off of it. Again, here we are standing in the atriums. We've walked past that entryway. We can see the impluvium right in front of us, and then there's the peristyle out back. And the wall paintings, again, are in the 4th style, so we think that they were probably done, maybe the house was damaged after the 62 earthquake, and so they were redone in that post period. But the house was probably standing before the earthquake. So we see some kind of, it's a recent renovation, essentially, after the earthquake. So here are a few more scenes, also super 4th style, right? And this might even be some better examples because you can really see the dado under here. So you can see that lower register has those marble blocks, which again is like the first style. And then we have these big monochromatic panels that are like the 3rd style with a scene in the middle. And then up top, we have like super heavy 2nd style stuff where there's a lot of depth, tons of architectural elements. It looks like you can look out this window right here, right? And there's stuff out there. So this is a really good example, a really good picture of 4th style. What we see actually on the 3rd style kind of panel in this is a depiction of myth. So what we're seeing here is the punishment of Ixion. So Ixion was a king who lusted after Zeus's wife Hera, or Jupiter's wife, Juno, right? So he lusted after Hera, and Zeus did not approve of that, even though Zeus wasn't the most faithful husband either. But anyway, he got mad, and so he creates this this sort of goddess nymph who it looks like Hera, and so he tricks the king into thinking that is Hera, who then sleeps with her, and then Zeus jumps out and says, "Gotcha." You know, how dare you sleep with my wife? And then he punishes him by putting him on a wheel, and he is forced to spin on this wheel for eternity as his punishment. So not Zeus's nicest moment for sure, but that's what we see here. So we see poor Ixion on this wheel being spun for eternity, and then we see Hermes, who's holding his attribute here. That's the god Hermes, who was the one who was ordered to put Ixion on the wheel, and then we see Hera. And this is Hera sitting there, and she is kind of on her throne, right? Because she's kind of, Zeus is the king of the gods, so she's kind of the queen of the gods, and so we see her watching the punishment, essentially. I mentioned last time that a lot of times these wall paintings would have moralizing messages. They would be scenes of myth, you know, from Roman religion, and so we kind of see that here. Actually, a similar thing, the idea of disloyalty, how it, you know, adulterers are punished. You know, if you try to seduce someone's wife, you'll be punished. So again, maybe a moralizing message here. Now, to get to some very interesting portraits in the House of the Getty. So there's something to note about the House of the Getty. It was owned by 2 men who were former slaves, and they had gotten their freedom, and then they really worked their way up in society, and they had this really nice house. They totally moved up the social ladder. They were like the nouveau riche, right? And they decided to go all out, as you can see in the last few images. This is really lavish stuff that we're looking at, and so definitely the sign of wealthy homeowners. But there were essentially these bachelors who lived there. And so we see some interesting wall paintings, one of which is this painting of Priapus, who was a minor deity in Roman religion, and his attribute was his giant phallus. So what we're seeing here, he was the god of fertility, god of fertility, and so it was actually a good luck sign. That he was sort of a good luck symbol, and he was painted here near the doorway. So when you first enter and exit the house, maybe you need a bit of good luck, and so there he is greeting you. He is weighing his phallus, as one does to see how bountiful he is. So again, a good luck symbol. We see a lot of this in Pompeii. If you go there are everywhere, pretty much obscene images or obscene graffiti, as I talked about last time, right? Insults that are written on the walls. So not all PG rated stuff. Something else that we see, I mentioned the presence of brothels. So there were brothels in Pompeii, one of the main ones. It's kind of in the center of the city, and you can go in it today, and it is filled with essentially ancient pornography. So we have wall paintings and frescoes of different sexual acts. Makes sense in a brothel, I suppose. And then in the brothel itself, we have, it's kind of just divided into a bunch of different bedrooms. So not all, as I said, PG rated stuff at Pompeii, definitely some other stuff as well. So that's the House of the Vettii. I want to move now to the House of the Faun, which is perhaps also the most famous. The House of the Vettii is a really famous house at Pompeii, and the House of the Faun is also super famous. This one looks like a pretty classic house, right? So that really looks like the first kind of generalized layout. It's very linear, there's not the rooms coming off to the sides as much. This is a very linear house, and this one actually has the two peristyles. So this is a very fancy house, because as I said, yeah, it has those two peristyles. I don't know if I should go through it again. I think we've hopefully got it by now, but again, entryway, atrium, you've got that super long line of sight. You can see all the way to both peristyles. We have had the Tublinum in the middle, and then we actually have another Tublinum. So there's a Tublinum off the atrium, and then there's a Tublinum in between the two peristyles. So maybe this guy needs to get a lot of business done. It is named for this faun statue that you see in the atrium. It would have stood in the middle of the impluvium. So it would have been surrounded by water, very nice. So it's named for that statue, as most homes in Pompeii are now, their modern names are named for things that we found there. But something really cool and really famous about this house is the Alexander mosaic. And this is actually a Hellenistic mosaic that is a Roman copy. So we think that this probably was a common style that you could have, that multiple people would have replicated in their homes. So even today, like I have an Ansel Adams painting, or photo behind me, not the real thing, right? But something that I have in my house because I like Ansel Adams. So that's what we see here, that whoever owned the House of the Faun liked Alexander the Great, and this was a mosaic style that we see elsewhere, and so they built it at their own home. The mosaic style is probably from 315 BC, and then we see this Roman copy from the late 2nd or early 1st century BC. It's pretty massive. If you can look at this, it would have occupied pretty much the entire floor of the Tublinum. So it would have been quite large. Today it's in the museum, and it depicts a scene of Alexander the Great in battle. So we think it might be the Battle of Thyssus. Could be, but it's probably Alexander fighting Darius III, who was the leader of the Persians, and so that was a big win for him, conquering the Persians and taking over the Near East. So an important battle for sure. And it's also just a crazy mosaic. I mean, there's so much action happening, so much detail to it. Really shows a skilled artist here. The looks on people's faces that we have are really expressive, emotional, very characteristic of the Hellenistic style, which the Hellenistic style comes between classical and Roman, kind of in that era, so right, 315. And it's really characterized by emotion and expression. We're not the demure, stoic athletes that we were in the classical period. We are over the top in pain and sorrow and happiness, whatever. We're showing it all on the faces, and you can see that, you know, if you look here, his face and this face and then the face there, all these people looking at each other, and then the amount of action taking place. Just really magnificent, magnificent work of art, and amazing that we have so much left of it. We think that this figure, if we're zooming in, so that figure on the horse right there, we think that probably is Alexander the Great. And you can notice him by his classic wavy hair, right? He's kind of got the long hair going. Looks pretty young, as he would have been. He was only in his early 30s when he died. And we see him decked out in very elaborate armor, so much detail to this armor. We see maybe like the head of Medusa, or I'm not sure what that is actually, but some kind of head on his armor. He's riding his famous horse, right? So lots of classic iconography of Alexander the Great, rendered in very rich detail. Again, today, not in situ, this is in a museum, but that is the House of the Faun. So although it's named for that little statue, this is the big thing from it, and just showing also, you know, the level of wealth that's in Pompeii. We see a lot of lavish home decoration, and that is, you know, because people were wealthy there. And I think I said that it was kind of a vacation town, right? So there was definitely some well-off people there. Moving forward, so we're just going to be looking at a lot of houses, a lot of different houses you should know, right? Next up, we're going to do the Villa of the Mysteries, and this is actually our last one. So these are the big ones that you have to know, basically. The House of Menander, the House of the Vettii, the House of the Faun, and the Villa of the Mysteries. So it's called the Villa of the Mysteries, although it is just a house, essentially. But it's a giant house, so I guess that makes it a villa. So it's a little bit backwards, we, you know, in our plan here. So you're going to enter at the top here, and that's the Fauces. And then instead of an atrium, it is actually kind of weird because we don't go straight from a Fauces into an atrium. Here we go from a Fauces into a Peristyle, and then the atrium is behind that. So this is the colonnade of the Peristyle, and here is the impluvium in that atrium. So not as, there's still a linear aspect here because we're still entering through the Fauces and we're looking all the way through the Peristyle to the atrium. So you can still have a really long line of sight, but there's just a million rooms that come off it, as you can see. And this actually would have been a house that made wine. That's right. So that's why it's called the villa, because it actually has some industry related to it. And so this would have been a house and a winery. So we see things related to winemaking, such as a wine cellar over here, or sorry, a wine press here, and then a wine cellar here. And so lots of kind of things of industry to make wine. And I did just want to compare it to the House of Menander. So I flipped the House of Menander upside down so that the entrances look the same. So just to remind you, right, this is what a typical house looks like, where you have the atrium and then you have the Peristyle, and here we have the Peristyle and then the atrium. So confusing, but also look at the size difference, right? There are so many more rooms in the Villa of the Mysteries because of that industry also. So that they definitely needed more rooms to make their wine. But the Villa of the Mysteries is named for these paintings, these super well-preserved and brightly colored wall paintings. These are done in the second style, and that is something that I wanted to note when we're talking about the second style. So I talked about how it can look like you're looking out a window with architectural elements, and maybe you're looking into a peristyle that has a temple in it. It can also feel like you're inside a or you're outside, sorry, that you're out in nature, you know, there's a landscape all around you on every side, but it can also feel like you are in the middle of a scene. So similar to the Etruscan necropolis, right, that we saw those tombs where when you look around the walls, it looks like you're part of the symposium. A similar thing is happening here where you feel like you're part of the scene that's happening on the walls. So that again is second style because it's tricking the eye. You have the trompe l'oeil here where you're, you know, you're tricked into thinking that these people are, you know, part of the room that you're in. So this is the last thing that we're going to look at, and this wall painting, as I said, is quite elaborate. Something else to note is that we do see some elements of the first style, so you see that down here in the dado, and then up top as well, so some more, gosh, what would you call that? Speckled marble, maybe, like not as clean marble, right? So it's got the swirls to it. Still marble, still trying to make it look like there's marble revetment on the walls. So what are we looking at here, right? So this scene actually goes around all of the walls. Sorry about that, I had some issues, so the video might look a little bit different. So here we are. Okay, so we're at the Villa of the Mysteries. What do we see on this wall? Well, in Roman religion, we've talked about different myths and things that took place there. For instance, I mentioned, the punishment of Ixion, right? So something else that we see, though, are less state-approved religious cults, essentially. So, and like cults today, right, they are a group of people who decide to believe in a certain thing, decide to dedicate themselves to a certain thing, and they're not necessarily part of a major religion. So in Rome, you would have these cults that were not necessarily, they were part of the pantheon, but they were more exclusive, they were smaller, they were not worshipped by as many people. And if you were in that cult, you were very dedicated to this one thing. And so what we see here is a reference to the cult of Dionysus, who is the god of kind of revelry and winemaking, an important god for that reason. Wine was important. And what did we see here? So the Villa of Mysteries was a winemaking house, right? It was like a winery. So it makes sense that they would have a serious dedication to Dionysus. And what we see here is probably a scene of initiation into the cult of Dionysus. And as we see in cults like this, that they had specific rituals that were specific to their cults. So what we see here is likely the preparation and then initiation of someone into this cult could have actually been in the room where the initiation took place. And so we're seeing, we see a matroness here, like a matron, an older woman, where we see a child who is reading something, which is probably some kind of sacred script to them, some kind of script that would be read at initiations. We see a woman here who looks at the viewer, again, tricking the eye, right? She's looking right at you. It's like she's really there. Looking at you, she's holding like a plate of food, could also be part of the initiation. And then this central scene that we see, this is the woman who is going to be entering the cult. So we see her with a veil on her head. There was some debate about maybe whether this was a picture of someone getting married, and some people still believe that it could be like a bride getting ready for marriage. But it's likely initiation into this cult. She has the veil over her head, and these women are helping her get ready. And then we start to see some really imagery, really specific imagery that goes with Dionysus. So those are these goats here, these satyrs, right? This man also associated with him, a satyr, perhaps also. So a lot of those goats are very sacred to Dionysus. They're his symbol. We see people sitting on this rock playing a flute also that sort of has to do with that. Right. Onto the next wall, the scene continues, and there's more figures. We see more satyrs, followers of Dionysus. One's holding up a mask, and another one is looking into a dish. So we think maybe he's looking at his reflection with the mask behind him or something. And then in the center, unfortunately, it is lost, but we're pretty sure that this is a depiction of Dionysus reclining into the lap of his lover Ariadne. And so which their meeting is a common myth that we see. So Dionysus is pictured here, and then we actually might see the same woman who was getting ready in this scene. She's now over here, so maybe some episodic narrative, right? Same character taking place in different scenes. She's here and she's kneeling, and we have this more mythical figure, perhaps some kind of goddess, with a whip, actually. And so we think it's some kind of initiation, some sort of that you had to be whipped apparently when you entered this cult. So that was kind of a thing with these, is that they had their own rituals, and they were very, very insular, right? They decided them on their own. So, and then it continues. We're not going to go through the rest of it, but it continues on this next wall also. And you can just barely see there's this woman who's watching the scene take place. So we see a lot of different gazes, right? This man kind of looks like he's looking over here. So there's a connection between all these walls. And it feels like one scene, feels like you're inside this scene and you're part of this initiation, which is why some people think that this is the room where the initiations took place. So that's going to do it. A lot that we've looked at here in our whole week of Pompeii. So I hope you enjoyed. Like I said, this is one of my favorite topics to look at because it's so well preserved, and I really hope that you get a chance to go to Pompeii and see it for yourself someday. So next time, what we're going to do is the last lecture before the midterm, which is the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So we've been looking at the people and how they lived, and now we're going to get back to some political history. We're going to be looking back at the emperor. And we're actually going to be looking at a dynasty. So when Augustus dies, we're going to be looking at the people who replaced him, which was called the Julio-Claudian dynasty. And that's going to culminate in the notorious emperor Nero. and Nero. Nero is a bit of a basket case and an interesting guy for sure. And he will be our last emperor before the midterm. So as a reminder, yes, the midterm is on Thursday, February 4th. And that lecture, that Julio-Claudian lecture, will be released on Sunday. So not Tuesday, because I want to give you more time before the midterm. So you'll see it released on Sunday. So other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time for the Julio-Claudians.